Wednesday, June 11th, 2025. I think last time we spoke about lectures was 2024. So technically a year, but 6 months more or less. I'm Vinny Park, President of the Royal Asiatic Society Korea. I am delighted to resume the activities of this society and deeply grateful to everyone for your unbroken support. Thank you for joining us tonight. We welcome friends and members who are attending in person here in Seoul and those joining us on Zoom. I express RAS Korea's sincere gratitude to the Asia Development Foundation for its continued financial support, more importantly, for believing in our mission. We are cordially reminded that the lecture content does not necessarily reflect the opinions or positions of the Royal Asiatic Society in Korea. Tonight, we have lecture number 1525. Wow. And tonight's lecture is no introduction. You all know him. We will be hearing from Matt VanVolkenburg. Just to bring everybody up to the same page, Matt first came to Korea in 2001 and is still here. And in 2005, began his blog, Dust of Popular Feeling, where for 20 years or so, he has written about modern Korean history, including film, music, urban redevelopment, and depictions of foreigners. He received an MA in Korean Studies from the University of Washington. He's the co-author of Called by Another Name, a memoir of Gwangju Uprising. His current research interests include 1970s youth culture, the history of Itaewon, especially for those who went on a walking tour of that, U.S.-Korea relations, and of course the Gwangju Uprising again. In his lecture tonight, Matt will educate us on the experiences of the POWs in Korea as a lens through which to view the final years of the Japanese Empire, the attempts of the Japanese to convince Koreans to join their imperial cause, and the opening weeks of the Korea's occupation by the US and USSR. So without further ado, here's Matt. Let's give him a big hand.
Good evening. Welcome. I'm glad you're all here. Glad we're all back to continue the RAS's activities. So, yes, I'm going to be talking about the Allied POWs in Korea during World War II. And I was first introduced to this topic by Jacko's Wetsuit back in 2010. And we both researched this together, and he gave a presentation for the RAS back in 2013. Since then, there's been a lot. Okay, maybe I'll first start by saying that the POWs all came from Singapore. That was considered, the fall of Singapore, February 1942, was considered the greatest disaster in British imperial military history. 130,000 POWs captured, 50,000 of them were British troops, and I think it was 18,000 were 17,000, sorry, were Australian soldiers. So, with what we know about the POW camps in Southeast Asia is that they were abysmal, they're absolutely horrific. Sometimes 20 to 30% death rates. Here, you can see they look like living skeletons, whereas the British POWs interned in Seoul look a bit healthier. One of the reasons for this is that this was a show camp. They were there for propaganda for several different reasons. One of them was as basically a show camp for the Red Cross to convince the Allies that their prisoners were being treated well. So they were treated marginally better. They were also brought for another region, which I'll get into shortly. But first, I was going to look at some of the sources. These are two sketchbooks that were published by POWs. And so this one was published by an Australian, and this one by a British soldier, actually two soldiers, and from two different regiments. And as well, this was a magazine, Nor Iron Bars was a magazine produced by the officers of the 2nd Battalion of the Loyal Regiment in secret from Singapore through to the end of the war. The Japanese never found those, and they're in the Lancashire Infantry Museum. There's also, this is a diary by John Lever, who was in the Seoul camp. Tom Wade's memoir from 1995, I think. He spent less than a year in Seoul, but he's got interesting observations. Several years ago, 3-4 years ago, Christopher Wilson published this book, You Must Endure, with a really good overview of what happened in the camps. And his father was a POW here. This book is recent, Sarah Kuttner's book, but it spends about 13 pages in school. So, but one of the oldest scholarly books was from 2002 from de Groen's. This was published at Australian War Memorial. I published an article in Transactions 2 years ago, looking at how they were used as propaganda in Korea. This mansell.com has all these primary sources. It's a wonderful website. And 7 years ago, Richard Baker did this innate thesis, focusing more on the use of POWs as a Red Cross show camp. And he's currently working on a book. And actually, I should say, as far as these sources are concerned, I was contacted by Mark Sullivan about a year and a half ago. And he sent me a USB drive with the photos he took of all this from the museum, and sent 2 copies of this book as well. So many thanks to him. And so the story starts at Changi POW camp in POW camp in Singapore, where the POWs were initially held. They were put into work parties. But then in the summer of 1942, the head of the Joseon Army, the Japanese Army in Korea, requested that 1,000 British and 1,000 American prisoners be sent to Korea in order to stamp out the respect and admiration of the Korean people for Britain and America and establish a strong faith in victory. So basically the units were the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Lancashire Regiment and the Yorkshire-based 122nd Field Regiment of the Royal Artillery. So these are British, and then the rest were a mix of different British and Australian units. So 1,100 of them were sent to Korea. About 100 of them were Australian. And there was 1 Newfoundlander. So now part of Canada. So we wrote a memoir, good one. So actually, before they got in these trucks, so according to Tom Wade, we paraded on a square outside the Changi Wire for our medical inspection, as Tokyo had given orders that no dysentery cases or carriers should be sent to the Divine Islands. Privates, sergeant majors, brigadiers, and generals, even the governor of the Straits settlements, had to drop their shorts in the open square, bow to Japanese medical regulations with the rest of us, and receive the sleek glass rod. The lower ranks certainly found this amusing, watching their generals get tested in this way. So they were put in these trucks, sent to a fumigation ship, and then they boarded this ship called the Fukai, and as one Australian POW remembered it. He said, I called it the Fukai Maru, but we had another name. But this was, yes, considered a hell ship. So there's 200, 350, 265, 185 prisoners in each of these. The cargo was coal And in the holds, they had these two levels which you couldn't stand up in, you could barely sit up in them. And yes, when the hatch covers were on, the air quickly became thick and foul. There were rats, mice, cockroaches, and other insects. Yes, this trip was pretty horrible. So it was so crowded and there wasn't much space on deck, so people had their meals. Some could eat up on the deck, some below. The meals, we were only given 2 meals a day at 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. The food was rice and a thin soup made of flour and water, a few onions, and 18 tins of Irish stew. 18 tins between 1,100 men. So it wasn't a lot of food. So they left Singapore. They actually sat in the ship for 2 or 3 days before even leaving. They went to St. John, which is now Vung Tau in Vietnam, and they managed to make a trade and pick up some fruit there from the locals, which was good for the POWs. Then they went to Takao, which is now like Kaohsiung in Taiwan. And they spent over 2 weeks unloading the coal and reloading the bags of rice. They were also paraded before the local population because Taiwan was a Japanese colony. And then they started heading for Korea. Though it was not as direct as this. They had to kind of go back sometimes to avoid submarine patrols. They also joined a convoy. Here we see the onions for the soup. Someone has broken into the shed and is handing them out. And then here he is being punished. So I guess he's actually holding the onions in his hands. But the unfortunate thing here is basically through corruption, the cans of stew disappeared. So they managed to acquire some pork and put it in the ice box, which had no ice. So they were cutting slabs of green stuff off of it and then putting it in the soup. So they started to all get diarrhea. And they had been using these latrines that were constantly lining up. And but then there was a typhoon, most of these latrines were washed off, and now the holes are just getting befouled. So it was awful. So they arrived in Busan, September 22nd. But they're actually made to stay on the ship for 1 more day. And the reason for that was the 24th was Chuseok. It was also a Japanese imperial holiday as well. And so everyone was ordered to come out and line up and watch a parade of the POWs. And to wear their best clothes as well. And so there's photos of them leaving. I guess they also had, as I said, once more, we went through our trouserless bow to the emperor, and then came down. They searched their implements that had been taken away, playing cards, and this card here is said to be not Japanese; it's Korean. And May 9th, 1942, the conscription system was announced, but then 2 weeks later, more wonderful news for our Korean subjects. You can now become a POW guard. And so, people applied, testing and training was carried out for 2 months. And the Korean language Japanese government published newspaper, the Mail Shinbo, talked about how this was a wonderful opportunity for the Korean born POW guards. And they're saying, this is one kind of truly honorable duty. I will strive to fulfill my duty to the best of my ability. And I think that if the embracing and bowing to British American thought is eradicated, I will truly please. Did these people ever say these things? Yeah. So they were fed on the wharf, and then they started the march. And as Tom Wade said, what was extraordinary was that the whole population was in brightly colored national dress. I had never before seen the whole city so spectacularly dressed. And Harry Morris from Newfoundland said, we were made to march around the city in Roman triumph style. And the cameramen were coming out and taking photos of all of the people who were fainting. But really, this whole thing talking about the colorful dressed people is also another form of propaganda, but this one is aimed at POWs, which then is fed back and fed back to the Koreans. But the soldiers opened their eyes wide in surprise, peacefulness and vitality of life here behind the guns. They saw that the Koreans as well wore colorful clothes and happy expressions and were full of energy. And this is a supposed quote from a soldier. From what we could generally see, we feel that there's limitless potential in the vigorous way Japan appears under wartime conditions, supposedly of POWs. So it was meant to impress the POWs, and then these kind of made-up quotes are fed back to the Korean audience. So the reason they were fainting on this tour, having had diarrhea, being badly fed, was that this was a 6.5 kilometer walk. The route is described in the newspaper. So, because they landed at the, they went to the train station and then went north, came down, went over here, stopped at this elementary school for lunch, where there were more interviews with the media, and then walked around here back to the train station, where they got ready to go to Seoul. Some of these buildings still stand. The court is still there. So here's images of the march in Busan. And so they went to Busan Station, they took bentos, got on the train. Now, a number of the men said they were surprised because they expected box cars. Instead, they got these nice carriages. I'm not sure how many of the men were in the carriages. Some may have been in boxcars. So they went off to Yongsan Station, but before getting to Yongsan Station, some of the cars were decoupled, and then they were sent to Incheon, where they got off at what is now Dongincheon Station, and lined up. And so once again, the local population comes out, and they go for a parade. I don't know the route, but there's Dongincheon Station. That was the POW camp. This is from 1944. The Allies thought the camp was here, but they were actually wrong. And there's almost nothing visual on this, because the main propaganda camp was Seoul. And none of the people who were doing sketches were at this camp. So we don't have a lot of visual material, though there are many written accounts from this camp. And there's kind of the layout of the camp. So, hospital. So here's the parade in Seoul. And the crowds out, marching through the streets and then going into the POW camp. A couple different shots of them entering. And then this was the route. Yongsan to Samgakji over here and up camp, which means they walked right up here. They walked right by this location. So, because we're right here. So there's an overview of the camp. This was a silk relay mill originally. And then Colonel Noguchi. Colonel Noguchi gives this speech. Says, this is a testament to the fact that the heavens favor the righteous. You have been defeated by the divine army. It is a natural consequence of your actions. You must well understand that your defeat was by the divine army. Some of you may still be troubled by your defeat. Since you surrender to us, you must clear your mind of hostility and follow our rules. You must endure being placed in a different environment and experiencing inconvenience due to different customs. Yes, this came up a lot. You must endure, and it's the name of the book I showed earlier. They were made to sign pledges saying they wouldn't try to escape. When they were told that's against international law, Noguchi said, well, we're not going to feed you if you don't sign it. So their officer said, well, it's being done under duress, so just sign. And one reason for showing this in the newspaper was this guy has a tattoo. Dirty foreigners. And there's a quote here from Tom Wade. The truth was, Colonel Noguchi was an honorable man, not inclined to cruelty or harsh punishments, and Lieutenant Colonel Ellington, in the middle here, was equally honorable, presenting our case to the Japanese in a calm, quiet voice, which Colonel Noguchi respected. Thanks to the character of these two men, life in the camp was bearable, correct, and decent. There were no abuses and a satisfactory discipline. There are a lot of people that would disagree with what he said. Noguchi wasn't as bad as some, and certainly some of the abuses were hidden from him by his underlings. Basically, when he went to visit the 3 different camps, things would improve at those camps when he was there. The guards wouldn't be quite so violent. But he is also the person who told in 1945, told Ellington, if the Allies invade, we're going to kill you all. Those were the orders. Also, some of the men under him, like Captain Terada, just mercilessly beat people. The Red Cross would send parcels and medicine. They wouldn't give out the medicine ever. Parcels would often be found, like Terada, one of the POWs was cleaning out his office and found Red Cross cans in his garbage. He'd been eating them. And when he complained, Terada called in 2 other guards and crap out of him for 2 hours. So he didn't complain about it.
Are they taking pictures with their dinner, or that's?
They were, well, future dinner. Yeah, they were raising rabbits to eat. There was also another, I mean, people could be beaten at any time for any reason. They weren't given the medicine. They were given things at strategic times for propagandist reasons. There was a Corporal Takuma who took a makeshift ladle made with a soup can attached to a piece of wood with nails, with the nails protruding, and beat a guy over the face, like tearing his face and ears apart. After that, everyone called him Scoops. And then in Incheon, Lieutenant Mizuchi was the doctor there, and he refused to hand out medicine, which led to 2 men dying. And he ended up at the end of a noose for that, at the end of the war. So, propaganda. So the Keijo Nippo, or the Kyosan Ilbo, here we have 3 pages, 10 articles, 6 photos on September 26th. This was the official government general newspaper. And this was from the blog Exposing Imperial Japan. So, and there's also these articles in the Korean language mail Shinbo. So I went through all of these. And let's see. The reaction to Noguchi's speech was, upon listening to these words, they realized that the tides of the Greater East Asian War were turning decisively since their own British military was defeated on all fronts, and their moods darkened and thickened with resignation. Dark shades appeared on their face for a moment, as if they were more troubled by homesickness than the thought of their country's military strength. And this goes on about brown hair, hands, tattoos, wearing women's clothing, just kilts, I think. This was the pitiful state of the British prisoner of war. And when they were sickly, they easily put their hands up like they'd only been taught surrendering. Their playing cards were worn from so much gambling, and they carried letters sent from the delinquent young women at the courts. So the main idea was the British were hopelessly decadent and weak and would be unable to mount a prolonged military resistance. So people should have faith in Japan winning the war. So that's the main idea of the Japanese. It's also the main idea of the Korean paper, but the Korean paper has another message. So we East Asians from the past suffered from the evil effects of raising up the Americans, British in our thoughts. Now, through the brilliant military exploits of the soldiers of our Imperial Army, today saw directly before our eyes British who were made prisoners of war and were deeply moved by the efforts of the Imperial Army, and our joy in becoming imperial subjects was ever greater. And so they go on and on. There's this mantra of being thankful for becoming imperial subjects. So it's the same message the Japanese get. The British are weak, will defeat them easily, and you should support this war, have faith. But there's the added thing of we should be so grateful for becoming imperial subjects.
Now, where's that photograph taken?
That's no, not the prisoners. This one gets interesting. So, quotes from Korean intelligence, church leaders, school principals. So they had experience with Westerners. On the pretext of carrying out missionary work throughout Asia, including China, the missionaries they sent carried out an evil kind of invasion. This is standard 1930s on Japanese propaganda about Western missionaries. This writer said, looking from the position of a religious person, I think again about the British and Americans when they came in the past, asking an overly proud attitude of arrogance and of only pretending to believe in Christianity. Now they have surrendered before the righteous Imperial Army, and the day has come when they must keenly feel the sins of the past. That is by Shidahara Rakujun. His Korean name is Baeknap-jun, who was the former president of Chosun Christian College. He was under house arrest at the time, so he probably didn't have a lot of choice. But English speakers might know him better as George Baek, who was president of RAS in 1950. Yes. Remember, Don Clark, the professor, told me he once asked about collaboration, and he said, never ask me that question again. And years later, he did, and that was the last conversation they ever had. So, well, there's inconsistencies. I mean, there's this portrayal of they're like children, the British, you know. They ask for rice and then they eat too much food and they get diarrhea. I'm like, oh, that's why. They're greedy. Then stepping on land for the first time, seeing unfamiliar scenes along the train line, what thoughts are coming and going in their heads? And looking out at the moon floating in the clear azure sky, they may have been crying as they thought of their wife and children waiting in their hometowns. So maybe this was meant to portray them as weak, but how the Koreans read this, especially at Chuseok, by the time Koreans are being sent all over the empire. So there may have been, this isn't in the Japanese material, this is in the Korean material. So it's possible the Korean writers were slipping in little hints, you know. So here's the prisoner camp in Seoul. There's actually photos taken from the 24th Corps newspaper, December 1945. The illustration, but they took numerous photos just months after it was liberated. So that's the view from the building looking at the camp and the neighboring Korean houses. I should add this was shared with me by Chapos Wetzler. So this is where the prisoners were sleeping. And the workhouse, yeah. And this is the solitary confinement cells. There was no bedding, no furniture, concrete and metal. Not a fun place to be in the summer or the winter, or anytime. So that's kind of laid out. There's the main barracks where the guards stayed, the hospital where they weren't given medicine, latrines, and kitchen, and then basically the store. The store never had anything in it, so except when the Red Cross came, there was a Red Cross inspection. It would be filled with stuff and then immediately taken out. And so you can see them gathered around the stove in the barracks. As it says, it's the room temperatures are frequently just a few degrees above freezing. So shows the men in the cookhouse making food and then portioning it out. Very fair with how you did this. People could get angry. So the wash houses, which froze over in the winter, the latrines. As I said, the canteen, which had almost nothing in it, usually. Every morning, first thing, and evening before lights out, there was roll call, and your squad leader had to give the number of men in Japanese and say who was there, who was sick, etc. A number of the officers did learn at least rudimentary Japanese, and the one person I've been quoting, Wade, he learned it quite well. Though he'd grown up in China, and every day they would go out on these work parties. Here they are going to the military warehouse, and they were searched when they went out and when they came home to search for contraband. The army warehouses might, just camp, that might very well be Camp Kim. It's not clear. They also at one point mentioned a military ordnance store, and there is one of these warehouses still in the Yongsan. So whether that was it, I'm not really sure. And so, yeah, there's lots of other, they did all sorts of work carrying grain. Yes, 66 pounds to 190 pounds. They also did work for a rail bed. I don't really know where this is. It might be there, it might be further down. But they drew this, and as I said, it was in the south, the bed of a railroad running down to a river. A number of spur tracks branching. And so they're kind of breaking these kind of cliff faces, and two POWs, I think in November 1942, were killed doing this work. They also worked at the farm where they were kind of baling hay. And that we actually kind of know where it is from this drawing. Because I don't know if anyone recognizes that building there, but that was the Governor General's second house that stood on Yongsan. And it was destroyed in the Korean War, and then it's hosted now, 121st. And so, yeah, that's where it was. There's Yongsan Station nearby. They also worked at Seoul Station. There's a POW stealing sugar. It was a good place to steal food. With Wade, who talked about, because he could read about 650 kanji. So he was involved in switching these labels and trying to get stuff sent in the opposite direction it was supposed to go. So I don't know if it really worked, but so there were various jobs they worked at. This is just used to illustrate the story Wade told of going to a temple. So he's working at army stables north of Seoul, wandered away after lunch as everyone else was just locked out and resting. And he went to a nearby Korean village. So quote, the Koreans were friendly but cautious. The children gathered around me and stared. I said good morning in Korean, the only phrase I knew, and they all replied. When a sweets vendor came along, I had 2 yen in my pocket, so I bought some sweets and gave them to the children. All the parents thanked me profusely and bowed. He then visited a nearby temple and watched three Korean gentlemen do calligraphy on the scroll, and he clumsily tried to do so as well. And I was horrified, it just looked terrible next to theirs. Quote, as I watched them practice and write two more characters, I thought this is a sight seasoned travelers would voyage 1,000 miles to see. These venerable Korean gentlemen in national dress practicing calligraphy in a peaceful and serene temple on a sunny spring afternoon. It was one of the most memorable scenes of my life. It was rare and it was very civilized. What a contrast to the world of military captivity and forced labor only 20 minutes away. Of course, Wade is a bit different than a lot of the POWs. And of course, some people did want to escape captivity. It didn't happen very often. Most people consider it impossible because white people trying to escape in Korea would be a little obvious. But in July 1943, Joe Moore, who had he'd been diagnosed with a terminal illness, so he just wanted to taste freedom. And Sergeant Bosworth, who they said he'd just gone mad, they attempted to escape, and basically the others tried to convince them not to go, but in the end, a few of them gave money and other implements to help them, and they climbed over the fence as the guards were distracted. But then Moore twisted his ankle and couldn't get very far, so they tried to sneak back and got caught, and that didn't go well. They were imprisoned in Sunnyman prison 8 years, 6 years, and accomplished 2 to 3 years. Moore didn't last long, he soon died. The others were freed at the end of the war. Also, Roger Pickett was found guilty of inciting Koreans against Japan. I think I read it, the sentence was either 7 years or 3 years, but what he did is he was working in the warehouse and he had Korean contacts. So he wrote a letter with facts and figures about the war and encouraging the Koreans to kind of have hope in the Allied victory. And he left it for a Korean contact, but Japanese police found it instead. So that didn't go well for him. He was released from Sutherland on August 17th, 1945, and died 12 days later. The officers asked if they could have a vegetable garden, which kind of amused the Japanese, but they said, okay. So they sent them to this kind of cavalry ground. And let's see. And that's sort of a good place to talk about the officers because they were secretly making this magazine, more iron bars, Germany and Japan. This one kind of captures the elation we felt first time they saw B-29 fly over. But they weren't bombing Korea, they were just flying over. They also admonished the readers, you have to be very careful, don't want the Japanese to discover this magazine, so read it very carefully. They never did. Here's a cartoon of the Japanese reading this issue, complete with the censors statement. And actually, Wade at one point made these, at Christmas in 1942, he made these fake Christmas cards, and he put fake censor stamps on them. That did not impress the anti-time. They thought, trying to be a spy, what are you doing? So you find a lot of drawings, poetry, a lot of it very sarcastic and directed at the Japanese, but also stuff like this. There wasn't much light in the barracks, so other guys would go towards the window trying to read, block other people's light. So there's the, I guess it was the YMCA sent records to the POWs, but they had to be censored first, which probably really confused the Japanese guards. There were a lot of contraband searches, but if you could say it's already been approved, I brought it from Singapore, then often you could get away with having it. But this is taken to an extreme where he's got this giant log, and he's like, from sports. There's also fake advertisements. There's an exercise program. Remove that rice belly. So, this is a cartoon, and this happened. Koreans, I don't think it happened often, but Koreans tried to break into the camp to get food, which gives you a sense of just how bad things were. Remember in Mail Shinbo in 1942, when they first arrived, even though the war has been going on for 5 to 6 years, China, the stores are full of supplies. Eric Harrison wrote, "It was amazing the pilfering that went on in this country. Everyone seemed to consider that it was their right to take anything that was worth stealing, and often the Koreans and the civilian Japanese would join with us in helping ourselves to consumments of food and soap. Everyone seems so hungry, ragged, and generally poverty-stricken that these circumstances stilled any twinges of conscience that they may have had." Even the Japanese were students. Yeah, Harrison had other stories, like being on a work party and there was a dead Korean man on the ground for days. Seeing children playing in the snow barefoot. Talking about the sufferings of the Korean civilians, the hands of the Japanese. One time he saw 3 Korean workers outside the military warehouse tied to poles that sat outdoors in the cold where they were beaten. And another, he saw a topless Korean woman tied up and kneeling on the ground near Seoul station. And so he said, a lot of the time when they were beaten in front of the local population, he said, the Japanese didn't seem to have any takers or anyone cheering them because everyone else had probably had their own experience. So in the very early days, they had a number of concerts. So after 1942, though, they were only held at Christmas. This was filmed for propaganda purposes. Here's some of the photos. There was one, I believe he was an actor, who cross-dressed and went by the name Gloria de Erie, who was very popular. You can see they had a great dinner at Christmas. And this is the kind of thing that was sent to the Red Cross. Here they are opening, one of the few times that they actually get a Red Cross package. Well, they get them more often than the other times, sure. But this is the kind of thing that was sent to the Red Cross. The Japanese were very careful in how they managed all of this. But by the end of 1943, it had become obvious because of escapees from the Philippines who told the truth about how terrible those camps were. They kind of stopped using Seoul as a show camp because they realized it was kind of pointless. But they did make a movie and showed it in theaters. Prisoners of War Who Came to Korea, recommended by the Governor General of Korea. Bruce, witness the raw and wretched state of defeated Anglo-American beasts. Powerful emotional experience. A day of joy has come to the 24 million compatriots of Korea. And this is it here. Edited by Han Seok-young. Han Seok-young is best known for his cartoons in the Joseon Ilbo, satirical takes on the 1920s modern culture, the modern girls, modern boys. He also directed a movie in 1941 called Volunteer, about a guy having troubles with women and money and dreams of becoming a soldier, but he can't because he's Korean. But then Koreans are allowed to volunteer, so he does, it solves all of his problems, hooray. Except he does sneak in when he goes off. The sister and his girlfriend just kind of stone-faced see him off. And the landlord and his family who were causing him money problems were standing with the Japanese militarists. So again, these might be the most you could get away with, these little hints of resistance. So 1943, the Hunan camp opens. Of course, this was a big industrial center. Chosun Chiso fertilizer, this is the biggest chemical complex outside of North America when it was built. There was a lot of, they engineered a lot of dams, rerouted rivers in North Korea and got really high hydropowers. So that's kind of what drew in cheap land as well. That drew in a lot of Japanese industrialists. So this was the camp built on a swamp. They had to deal with a lot of mosquitoes and fleas, and they worked. As it says here, 239 from both Seoul and Incheon went there in box cars. If they would go on these work parties, which were freezing in the winter. So the one bad thing there, freezing in the winter, fleas, but better access to food because there was fish and some vegetables. But there was another smaller factory, which caustic soda, calcium chloride, I think. So this is the buildings of the camp, that's the factories, that's how far away they were. And so they were working lime kilns, 24 hours a day, shift work. I guess when they started, they were initially doing maintenance and other jobs, but from mid-1944, they started working in furnaces. And they're a bit overdressed. Usually they were just wearing loincloths. It was so hot. And also there was one POW from Australia, an engineer named Reginald Hayter, who figured out how to basically block the water that cooled the furnace in order to sabotage it. So they were successful in doing it one time. Unfortunately, he eventually got double pneumonia, and the doctors didn't give him any medications. Died before the end of the war. Did using POWs as propaganda work? So you take out his chief of staff. This is when the POWs first arrived, 1942. So on the whole, it seems that the idea was very successful in driving all operation for the British out of the Queen's minds and in driving to them an understanding of the situation. The rules for the POW parade do not adopt an insulting or crafty attitude. Don't talk to them or be kind. Don't give them any objects. If you find an escaped prisoner, report them immediately. Do not aid prisoners in their escape or hide them. Other than the first one, Korean through all of those rules. So here they talked about how Korean civilians, children in particular, came to watch the prisoners at work and regularly passed apples and turnips and cigarettes to the working men. This was in Incheon. And basically mid-1945, Incheon became overwhelmingly full of American prisoners, or much more recent. So Chester Johnson had survived the Bataan Death March and had been sent to Japan and eventually sent to Incheon, and he was starving. So he and three others ran into a restaurant, and they didn't escape the camp. They were on a work detail, but they were just so hungry. So one employee, Kim Jin-won, hid them in an inner room and gave them something to eat. 20 years later, he's commanding, I think, the 7th Army, and is in Korea. He's living there, so he went back. The restaurant was still there. The employee was now the owner. And so he said he saw me burst into tears. I imagine they were maybe working somewhere around here. So this is where the restaurant was. I mean, they were caught very quickly afterwards, but at least they got to eat a little. Friendly relations between the guards and the POW. So 5 guards in Hunam claimed that they had tried on many occasions to help the prisoners, but were caught and punished by the Japanese, who were supposed to have told them, you guards, to be guarded board, and the POWs were your events. Korean guards had a very bad reputation in Southeast Asia, even worse than the Japanese. But that's not the case in Korea. The complaints I've read are all about, almost always, about the Japanese guards. There are some mentions of Korean guards, but I mean, was it Bill Bray, Australian, who talked about? So, well, there was one Korean guy who would give us this information, kind of be helpful, but he'd give us a hell of a time at times. You couldn't appear to be too nice. So our most important source of information was news given to us by friendly civilians and guards. Actually, when that escape in Incheon happened, another British soldier was thinking of escaping and talked to a guard who had been educated by a Scottish missionary, could speak English well, and said, can you make me a map? And the guard was looking. So, but when he saw what happened to the other guys who escaped first, he decided not to escape. Actually, I think he gave them the map. So, but in the end, he didn't get caught. He didn't get in trouble. The native population was forever asking our men to teach them English. Very different today. There was a quote from, I don't know what was his name. Anyway, he said, this could take some weird forms. It was not uncommon to be walking along the street and hear, from a side street, hello, you bastard, I love you. I don't think. He also told a story of the interactions in the warehouse, because there were young Korean women working. And so the guards, when the POWs, when the guards went around with kind of speak pidgin Japanese to them, and they would answer back. And he just told the story of this friend of his who always liked to joke around. So he would ask them a question in Japanese, and they would reply, and whether he understood or not, he would just go like this face, and so which led to many sidelong glances and tittering and laughter. And I mean, I've seen English teacher pull that kind of thing before, so it sounded very familiar. And this was the Newfoundlander in his memoir. The news that the Japanese would shoot POWs before the Russians arrived was duly relayed to us by two Japanese Marines of the Guard, who offered to provide us with some rifles for a breakout on the night of August 16th. This was in Hanau when the Russians were approaching. So that's rather friendly. So this is the diary of John Lever, and he talks about how the Koreans had put up Korean flags and they changed Japanese flags as he put into the peculiar looking Joseonese flag. This was a photo I found of this girl reaching through the gate at the camp. This would have been after the B-29 started dropping through, which was about August 30th, I think. They waited a while in Seoul for any kind of news. Oh wait, so there's really another good quote here. All right, the diary writer also mentions that 2 U.S. airmen were brought in August 17th, and the next day they had been shot down August 15th. Because there were more American planes flying over at that time, though not much bombing going on. And as I said, the Koreans were deliriously happy Japan was beaten. And when the first B-29 food drop came, these were 2 40-gallon barrels welded together with food, and the parachutes didn't work, so it went through the roof of a Korean house and killed a Korean woman. So quite sad. So in this, the diary writer's final entry, September 3rd, they're taken to a riverside, and maybe the Han River, and they row across and find a little village. So the only currency I had was 2 bars of chocolate and 1 yam. So we bought a little fruit, and then went to a house and he gives another name, but it's clearly makgeolli, whitish like milk and tastes like a distant poor relative of champagne. So Jeffrey and I then strolled along until we came to a small Korean cottage. Making ourselves welcome, we walked in and were invited to sit on the porch and admired the baby and gave the boy, who was about 10 years old, some chewing gum. The Koreans seem very fond of chewing gum. Later, we wandered around exchanging greetings with the locals till we came to a small village. That's where they drank sake and gave a chocolate bar to the owner's little daughter. We handed around our American cigarettes and after a pleasant little interlude said goodbye to most of the village, who by that time were trying to congregate into the shop. And then his last entry, we have a visitor tonight, a Roman Catholic priest named Quinlan. This is Thomas Quinlan. He arrived, I think, in 1940, and then was put under house arrest. He's Irish, so that's why he wasn't expelled. And so he'd just been released. He stayed in Korea, became the bishop of Chuncheon, and was caught on the first day of the Korean War, was put on the Tiger Death March in December 1950 in northern North Korea and put into a camp for almost 3 years. And so this was taken when he was released. So he underwent imprisonment twice in Korea. The first attempt to see the POWs was the sort of pinnacle of, what was it, Project Eagle. This was the OSS, the precursor of the CIA, working with the Korean Provisional Government. They were planning to do kind of basic guerrilla operations, covert operations in Korea. It never came to fruition because the war ended. But basically, the only thing they did was this mercy mission where they just had enough fuel to fly to Korea. And so they landed at Yoido. And the Japanese, they radiated that the Japanese knew they were coming. They got them, they said, oh, we want to see the POWs. And they said, you're not accepting our surrender? And they said, no, man, get out of here. And so they pulled out tanks and like, okay, but we don't have any fuel. It would take a while to get fuel, so they ended up spending the night there. And later, I think the commander, Willisburg, got some sort of commendation. But that was before they found out they spent the night drinking with the Japanese soldiers and singing report songs together. Seeing that like a little bit too much fraternization. So, and on Mark DiCaprio 3 years ago in Transactions wrote about this story, the whole back. So you can read more about it there. Also on this trip was Lee Bom-suk, who was Korea's first prime minister and defense minister, and head of the Minjok terroristic breaking core. Yeah. I hear different dates, either the 26th to the 28th. That the Russians liberated Poland. So Eric Harrison said 2 Russian officers walked into the camp, surprised that they were that the POWs were even there. They were promptly shouldered and shown around the camp to the delight of everyone, including themselves. These happy feelings will change. But in the beginning, very friendly. So they're waiting for the B-29s to find them. Shots inside the barracks. So they disarm the Japanese, but then later the Russians also tried to disarm them. The Russians were just insane. They weren't organized. They were pretty rough looking, hadn't bathed in months. Were often drunk, would shoot at anything. Harrison talked about how Koreans, if they saw a Russian, would just jump into the nearest bush. They didn't know what to expect. And then, I guess it was maybe the 28th, or maybe it was also on the 29th. They started dropping B-29s down them, started dropping supplies. One went through the hospital in the camp. I think hurt a few people. The Russians then said, okay, from now on, they have to land and just drop them. And so they sent up some yaks and radioed and said, you have to land at Hamhung Airport. When they saw the airport, they said the airstrip's not long enough, so they turned away and they were fired at. And so they went out over the sea, most of the crew bailed out, and then he decided, well, okay, we'll try and land at the airport. They managed to do so. And so they were all interned in the POW camp. And they were there until September 11th. It was decided that it was too damaged to try and fix it. Plus, the Russians had taken some things. It's possible they reverse engineered it to build their own bomber. But yeah, they were eventually flown out on September 11th and flew to Seoul, stayed at the Joseon Hotel. And it was they who mentioned to the Americans who had just arrived that, by the way, there's POWs up there. So the Russians had said, oh, we're sending them to Vladivostok. Oh, but they had done nothing. So US lands Incheon on September 8th. A sort of recovery team came the day before, went to Incheon camp. And so Incheon was liberated first. And we have film of this. And this was given to me by Chihun's. So
And at this point, the war had officially been over for a month or something.
3 weeks. 3 weeks. So this is at Incheon. So these are probably also the Americans as well. British, Australians, Americans. And so they head off to Seoul. Well, I guess they had, yeah, they were drawing the pages, I guess, within, yeah, guess it looks like that's definitely in camp.
Is Incheon POW camp still somewhat recognizable if you go there?
It's a school. I can show you what they look like now. So plans for release of POWs.
Pretty much bad, actually. I should have.
At this point, they'd also just gotten all that food from the VU between us. So that, I think that was pretty decisive. There were points where in the first month or two, they'd lost like 15 pounds. Yeah. Nice hats. So yeah, the POW were riding. We all know where that is. Seoul Station. Seoul Station. I forgot to mention at the garden where the officers were growing food. For 2 years, he was bringing Japanese newspapers for them to read so they could get some information. So that's why he's being held up by the POWs. And so there were 168 men in Incheon, 158 in Seoul, but still 344 in Hunan. So 680 in total. There's another shot at the camp. And so they were taken to a hospital ship, taken to Manila, and then the British were taken to Vancouver, took a train through Canada to Halifax, and then were shipped home from there. So this was in Hunan. So basically, September 11th, the Hog Wild crew, the P-29 crew, goes back to Seoul. They say, okay, these guys are still up there. Negotiations with the Russians begin. And September 15th, an Australian reporter went up to see what was going on and was actually gaining intelligence. His report says, on 7 successive days, I saw Russians looting in Hunan and Hamhung districts and areas to the south and north. On one occasion, I asked and was allowed to accompany a looting party. The procedure was this: the Russians armed with Tommy guns would drive up to a Korean or Japanese house, fire a few shots in the air, break into the house, and drag out what women, mostly young girls, they could find, put them into the truck along with the furniture and the other articles that caught their eyes, and drive off to their barracks. After a day or two, the girls would film out on the street. On the occasion I accompanied the looting, I protested when the Russian brought forth a young girl in tears. They laughed, waved their guns at me significantly, and carried on with the business. Basically, the attitude of the Russians is bringing together the Japanese and Koreans for the first time in 40 years. He also noted that many of the Japanese and Korean women in the area were bringing food to the POWs, and they said that they considered the Russians their enemies. They didn't want the Russians to get the food. So also Harry Morris, the doctor from Newfoundland, was helping a lot of the local peoples. So he made a really good name for himself and for the POWs. And basically a similar scene, this is in Seoul, but imagine these are trucks, and that's Hamhung Station. And so the Australian said, I think the most revealing scene occurred on September 21st when the prisoners were taken in Russian trucks to Hamhung Station on the first stage of their journey home. Although under heavy Russian guard, each truck carried 2 Russians, each armed with Tommy guns. Koreans and Japanese lined the streets and waved and cheered, wept openly, and many waved American and Korean flags. It was the same at the station. Although the Russians kept the crowd at a distance, the locals cheered and clapped as the train pulled out. It was really touching. They regarded the prisoners as their friends. From my observations of the 2 zones, I say definitely that Korea is being torn in half. People in the northern zone are terrified of the Russians. Industry is at a standstill. And the one desire, it seems, is to get south to the American zone as quickly as possible. The people, except for the few who ardently support the Russians for their own political ends, are pro-American, would like America to take over the whole of Korea. It sounds like Japan's plan to make Koreans turn away from Americans and British didn't really work. So that was the route home. I don't have time for that one, but on their way back, they stopped at the graveyard. I'm not sure where this was, but this is where the POWs were buried, somewhere within walking distance of the camp. There's Reginald Hayter's grave. He was the one who sabotaged the furnaces. So they were taken to the hospital ship, and then the HMS Colossus took them to Manila. And then they took a troop ship to, well, those were going east, took a troop ship to San Francisco and went across New York and went home. There's Noguchi on trial. These were this was in 1948, I believe. So the war crimes trials. Noguchi got 22 years. Torada, the guy who was an absolute terror, beating people, about 37. The camp medical officer Incheon got death by hanging. Scoops got 31 years. So, and notice, yeah, there's no Koreans on this list, they're all Japanese. But by the time the peace treaty was signed in 1952, there was a lot of clamoring to let these people go. And by 1958, they'd all been separate. So, X for the ones who were hidden. There's still some sort of building where the Mount Camp was, and there's still a factory there. Some source for that. This is in Incheon, Shinwang Elementary School. And that's from this blog, Incheon yesterday and today. And oddly enough, I managed to figure this out by looking at the property. Match that map. And this is Shinwang Middle School. They're not related. Jacko went and visited this school and talked to the principal and asked him. They said, no, that's just a coincidence. Schools have the same name. And he gave Jacko this nice book, 60th anniversary the school. So it started about 1946 or 7. This is from 1948. 1950, the first graduation ceremony where the POWs used to sleep. And that's what it looked like, and I figured it out, went to visit the map. Street view looked like that. I'm like, yeah, that's the building, and it was gone. You could just see the ghost image of it, and that had happened only 2 months prior, in 2011. Thank you. Any questions?
With those POW and any Korea independent soldier army, they have any relationship between those connections? Any?
Not that I know of. I mean, there were, they were in connection with some Koreans who wanted news, but I don't know if there was anyone who was, specifically involved with Independence Army or anything like that.
In case of them escape, they will to so they can be and they the police more shameful than your down, so they can be more shameful.
Oh yes. Oh, it was terrible. Yeah. They were treated much worse sitting in prison.
You mentioned the Kempeitai, which is the military police of the Japanese, but were they actually the ones administering these camps, or was it a different, were they just like agents of the Kempeitai that was administered just by the army, or we know?
I think
who
it
actually
was,
administered?
it's a good question. The Kempeitai were definitely involved. They were around. I know that administratively, the camp was considered a part of the Onsen garrison, based. Yes.
How many prisoners died in captivity and how many were ex? I mean, note that the medical officer was sentenced to death. Was he actually executed?
Yes.
And what had he done? He's
He-
the only one who was sentenced to death.
because he was specifically responsible for the deaths of 2 prisoners who he could have helped if he'd given them medicine. So,
Okay, but how many prisoners died in? All were ex. I mean, died by execution.
none were executed.
Okay.
Because, I mean, although you could consider being put in Sunnyman prison to be a very slow execution. Because the one prisoner did die there and one died shortly after being released. I forget the exact number of the 1,100 who were initially sent. It was maybe in the high 20s, around 30 who died. So it was about a 2 to 3% death rate, which was quite low. For example, I forget which base, it might have been Fukuoka in Japan, was like 9% death rate. And then when you move to Southeast Asia, it's appalling. death rates. Yeah. Yes.
After the investigation, after the end of the report, then the number of denied kilometers, the number of denied kilometers in Korea, well, 600 you said so, doing extra.
680.
680. Yeah.
And you mentioned the trial, which was held in Yokohama. Is the same trial as local trial in Canada?
I think the wording I saw was the minor trial. Was that? I can't remember if that's. Nothing there. At any rate, it was. I don't think it was the main Tokyo trials. Sorry, the other information. It was the official word had like a minor crime child or something like that. So I don't think it wasn't. It was in Yokohama. I don't think it was the Tokyo trials. It was different. Sorry, you had a question.
Under those harsh conditions, how they were keeping their ranking, was there any case of suicides?
No, there weren't any suicides. One of the things, especially that helped, like the loyals, the Lancashire loyals, and the 122nd regiment, was the fact that they were all from Saskatchewan. A and B, those regiments were locally based, so they were all from the same area in England. So I think that kind of helped. That helped to. Yes, solidarity. Yes.
And secondly, the Poles who lost their lives, their location of their graves are not in Seoul.
I would kind of assume, it's a good question. I would kind of assume that they were returned home or something, because I mean, certainly at the time it was known, and I'm pretty sure they would have done something to bring those ashes home. Not entirely sure. Yes.
Was that an official British or Allied response to show us, or did they just see right through it?
What was it? The one the Masters thesis talked about how no, Britain did like local British Red Cross magazines did reproduce a number of those photos and say, well, yeah, there were newspaper articles saying, well, it turns out that they're being better treated in Korea. And I mean, in comparison to the utterly appalling conditions in Southeast Asia, they were, but they were still being treated pretty terribly. Yeah, I mean, there's a quote by Eric Harrison saying, we were given food, calculated in calories, just enough calories to keep us alive. The other problem, of course, was that Korea was so cold. So, very cold, yes.
Do you happen to know if the Australian police testimony about crimes and raping was the only crime of Russian face? I'm interested in knowing whether it was systematic or not. And secondly, if I made more comparisons to German because there were thousands and thousands of sources and reports of the Red Army systematically raping all the German migrants that were in the villages, and there's some of the academic papers claiming, I mean, could be a liberal claim level that at least 100,000 people were. But then there was never a political interest for the war, etc., to actually do any kind of research into that. So I could also imagine more laws if the political interest in doing any academic research into those violent crimes, but I saw people ever actually investigated it further.
I don't think it's even really known. I would say I don't think it was systematic, as in it was organized from the top. He makes the point many times, and this was in his, as soon as they returned on September 21st, he went with the POWs on the train to Seoul. His report is dated the next day, so this was reported to the US military. But he also, in it, he reported that he said they were just completely disorganized. Like, it's just kind of madness. One of the things was that industry had just kind of fallen by the wayside, and the Russians had no interest in any of this. Yeah, these were not their best and brightest. I also read that, what was it, in the book Brothers at Arms, said that eventually these reports got back to Stalin, and so this kind of behavior, I don't know if it entirely stopped, but definitely slowed. There just seemed to be not much control.
Final question. Do you know what happened to that boy that used to deliver newspapers to POW tears? I'd like to bring him in as next lecture.
Yeah, I do not know.
Well, thank you, Matt. Thanks again for joining us.